What if I told you that beneath the ruins of ancient cities across the Middle East, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a god so terrifying, so demanding, that entire civilizations built their existence around appeasing his wrath? A deity whose very name struck fear into the hearts of kings and commoners alike, whose altars ran red with sacrifices that would horrify us today, yet whose worship spread like wildfire across the ancient world for over 2 millennia. In the shadowed valleys of ancient Canaan, where the Mediterranean breeze carried the smoke of countless offerings skyward, stood temples dedicated to a god whose power was believed to control the very forces of nature itself. Thunder crashed at his command, rain fell at his pleasure, and drought descended as his punishment. This was not just any ancient deity gathering dust in forgotten texts. This was Baal, the storm god, the fertility bringer, the lord of life and death whose influence shaped the destiny of nations and whose legacy would eventually collide with one of history's most pivotal religious movements. Archaeological discoveries across Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon continue to reveal the staggering scope of Baal's dominion over the ancient Near East. From the great temples of Ugarit to the hidden shrines scattered across Phoenician trading posts, evidence mounts that no other deity commanded such widespread devotion, fear, and controversy. Clay tablets inscribed with hymns to his power, bronze figurines depicting his lightning-wielding form, and altar stones stained with the evidence of ritual sacrifice paint a picture of a god whose worship was as magnificent as it was terrifying. But Baal was more than just another ancient deity demanding tribute. He represented the fundamental struggle between chaos and order, between the life-giving rains and the devastating drought, between fertility and barrenness. To understand Baal is to understand the very heartbeat of ancient civilization, how entire societies organized themselves around the whims of forces they could not control, yet desperately needed to survive. The mystery deepens when we realize that this feared god would eventually find himself at the center of one of history's most dramatic religious conflicts. The same deity who commanded the loyalty of kings and the devotion of farmers would become the ultimate enemy in the biblical narrative, the false god whose worship threatened to corrupt God's chosen people. Yet archaeological evidence suggests the reality was far more complex, far more nuanced than simple good versus evil. But to understand how a Canaanite storm god became one of history's most controversial religious figures, we must journey back over 4,000 years to the dawn of civilization itself, where the first whispers of Baal's name emerged from the fertile crescents of Mesopotamia and began their inexorable spread across the ancient world. Our story begins in the shadow of Mount Hermon, around 3000 before Christ, where the morning mist clung to cedar forests and the Jordan River carved its path through valleys that would witness the rise and fall of countless kingdoms. Here, in the land that would later be called Canaan, scattered tribes of farmers and herders faced a reality that modern civilization has all but forgotten: complete dependence on forces beyond human control. Picture the scene. A Canaanite farmer named Ahiram stands at the edge of his barley field, watching the cloudless sky with growing desperation. For 3 months, no rain has fallen. His crops wither under the relentless sun, his livestock cluster around dwindling water sources, and his children ask questions he cannot answer. In his world, there are no weather forecasts, no irrigation systems, no government assistance. There is only the will of the gods, and right now, the gods seem angry. But Ahiram knows exactly which god controls his fate. Every child in Canaan learns the stories from birth. How Baal-hadad, the mighty storm rider, battles the forces of chaos to bring life-giving rain to the earth. How his voice thunders across the heavens. How his lightning splits the sky. How his very breath determines whether families feast or starve. This is not abstract theology. This is daily survival. The name itself carries power. Baal, meaning Lord or Master in the ancient Semitic languages. But this was never just a title. It was a declaration of absolute authority over the natural world. In the pantheon of Canaanite deities, Baal stood as the divine king, the cosmic warrior whose battles against the sea god Yam and the death god Mot determined the fate of all living things. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Es Safi and Hazor reveals the sophistication of early Baal worship. Bronze figurines dating to 2500 before Christ show him standing triumphant, one hand raised to hurl lightning, the other gripping a cedar tree, symbols of his dominion over storm and fertility. These weren't crude idols of primitive peoples, but masterfully crafted representations of humanity's most fundamental fears and hopes. The worship rituals themselves were elaborate affairs that consumed entire communities. During the spring planting season, hundreds would gather at hilltop sanctuaries called high places, where massive stone altars stood open to the sky. The ceremonies began before dawn, with priests in elaborate robes chanting hymns that echoed across valleys still shrouded in morning mist. Drums pounded rhythms that seemed to summon the very heartbeat of the earth. But it was the sacrifices that truly revealed Baal's terrible power over his worshippers. Bulls and rams, symbols of fertility and strength, were slaughtered on altars designed to channel their blood into the earth below. The logic was inescapable. Life demanded life, blood demanded blood, and only through sacrifice could mortals hope to move the heart of a god who controlled their very existence. Yet Baal was more than a storm god demanding tribute. Ancient Ugaritic texts, discovered in the 1920s and finally translated decades later, reveal a complex divine personality that embodied the entire cycle of agricultural life. In these epic poems, Baal dies each autumn, descending to the underworld in cosmic battle with Mot, the god of death and drought. 4 months, the earth mourns his absence. Crops fail, animals become barren, and humanity faces the annual threat of extinction. Then, through the intervention of his sister consort Anat, goddess of war and love, Baal returns each spring in glorious resurrection. The rains return, the earth blooms with life, and fertility is restored to both land and people. This wasn't just mythology, it was the theological framework that explained why the world worked the way it did. King Zimri Lim of Mari, ruling around 1775 before Christ, understood this divine economy perfectly. His royal archives, preserved in cuneiform tablets buried for nearly 4,000 years, reveal a ruler who spent enormous resources on Baal's temples while his kingdom faced constant threats from neighboring powers. When drought struck his lands, he didn't send armies to conquest new territories. He sent gold and precious offerings to Baal's priests, understanding that divine favor was worth more than human military might. The influence spread like ripples across the ancient world. Phoenician traders carried Baal's worship to every port city in the Mediterranean, from the Spanish coast to the shores of North Africa. In each new location, local populations adapted the storm god to their own needs. Baal Hammon in Carthage, Baal Shamim among the Arameans, Baal Peor in the Transjordan highlands. But it was in the great trading cities of the Levantine coast where Baal's power truly flourished. In Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, merchant princes built temples that rivaled the grandest structures of Babylon and Egypt. These weren't just religious buildings, they were economic powerhouses where international trade was blessed, contracts were sealed with divine authority, and the wealth of nations was offered to secure favorable winds for merchant fleets. The priests of these coastal temples wielded influence that extended far beyond religious matters. They were meteorologists reading the signs of weather patterns, agricultural advisors counseling farmers on planting seasons, and political advisors whose interpretations of Baal's will could determine whether kingdoms went to war or sued for peace. By 1500 before Christ, Baal worship had become so entrenched in Canaanite society that it seemed eternal, unshakable, destined to endure as long as humans needed rain and fertility. The great cycles of death and rebirth, drought and plenty, had been explained and ritualized. The fear of chaos had been channeled into magnificent temples and elaborate ceremonies. An entire civilization had organized itself around appeasing a god whose power seemed as real as the thunder that echoed across ancient valleys. But what none of these worshippers could foresee was that their mighty storm god was about to encounter a challenge unlike any other in his long history. A confrontation that would echo through the millennia and reshape the very foundations of human religious thought. The year was approximately 1446 before Christ when a figure emerged from the wilderness of Sinai who would forever alter the religious landscape of the ancient world. Moses, leading a confederation of Hebrew tribes recently escaped from Egyptian bondage, stood at the borders of Canaan with a message that would shake the very foundations of Baal worship. There was only one true God, and his name was Yahweh. But this was not merely a theological disagreement between competing deities. This was a collision between two entirely different ways of understanding reality itself. For over a millennium, the inhabitants of Canaan had lived by the rhythm of Baal's seasonal death and resurrection. Their agriculture, their politics, their very identity as a people was woven into the fabric of storm god worship. Now came strangers from the desert claiming that all of this, the temples, the rituals, the entire cosmic order, was not just wrong, but abomination. The Hebrew conception of divinity was revolutionary in ways that modern minds can barely grasp. Where Baal was one god among many, part of a complex divine family tree with competing interests and limited powers, Yahweh claimed absolute sovereignty over all creation. Where Baal died and was reborn in endless cycles, Yahweh existed outside of time, unchanging and eternal. Where Baal required constant appeasement through sacrifice and ritual, Yahweh demanded something far more radical: exclusive loyalty and moral transformation. The first major confrontation came not through military conquest, but through demonstration of power that struck at the very heart of what made Baal credible to his worshippers. During the conquest of Canaan, as Hebrew tribes established footholds in the hill country, they encountered something that defied all logic according to Canaanite theology. These desert nomads, who had never performed the proper rituals, who had never offered sacrifice to the storm god, were somehow prospering in the land. Archaeological evidence from sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa and Tel Rehav reveals the dramatic changes that swept through the region during this period. Canaanite high places, elaborate ritual centers that had operated for centuries, were suddenly abandoned. Pottery styles changed, architectural patterns shifted, and most tellingly, the bronze figurines of Baal that had been common household items virtually disappeared from the archaeological record in areas of Hebrew settlement. Yet the conflict was far from one-sided. The established Canaanite city-states, with their sophisticated military technology and well-established trade networks, initially held every advantage. Kings like Jabin of Hazor and the coalition of 5 Amorite rulers commanded armies equipped with iron chariots, cutting-edge military technology that should have easily crushed any collection of tribal militias. The Battle of the Waters of Merom, fought around 1400 before Christ, exemplified this clash of civilizations. Jabin's forces, fighting under banners bearing Baal's lightning bolt symbol, represented not just military might but divine authorization. These weren't merely soldiers. They were holy warriors defending the cosmic order itself against chaos and impiety. But when Hebrew forces, led by Joshua and fighting in the name of Yahweh, achieved victory after impossible victory, something unprecedented happened in the ancient world. People began to question whether Baal was actually powerless. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the fundamental assumptions of Canaanite religion were being challenged not by philosophical argument, but by observable results. The real crisis came during the period of the Judges, roughly 1375 to 1050 before Christ, when Hebrew settlement had become established but not yet dominant. This was the era of cultural fusion and religious confusion, when the descendants of desert nomads found themselves trying to survive as farmers in a land whose agricultural cycles they didn't understand, surrounded by neighbors who insisted that success required Baal's blessing. The story of Gideon perfectly illustrates this tension. Archaeological evidence from Tel Harar suggests that mixed Hebrew Canaanite communities were common during this period, places where Yahweh worship existed alongside traditional Baal shrines. When Gideon destroyed his father's altar to Baal and cut down the sacred Asherah pole, he wasn't just making a religious statement. He was challenging the economic and social foundations of his entire community. The response was immediate and violent. Gideon's neighbors demanded his death not because they were necessarily devoted to Baal personally, but because his actions threatened the delicate balance of relationships with divine powers that kept their crops growing and their families fed. From their perspective, Gideon was not a reformer but a dangerous radical whose reckless impiety could bring divine judgment on the entire community. Yet when Gideon's subsequent military victories proved that Yahweh's power was real and effective, the paradigm began to shift. The God of the Hebrews wasn't just another deity to be added to the pantheon. He was demonstrating superiority over the very forces that Baal claimed to control. This pattern repeated across the region as Hebrew influence expanded. In city after city, the arrival of Yahweh worship created profound social disruption. Priestly classes who had maintained their authority for generations suddenly found their expertise questioned. Kings who had derived legitimacy from their special relationship with Baal discovered that divine authorization was no longer automatically theirs. The economic implications were staggering. Temple complexes that had functioned as banks, grain storage facilities, and centers of international trade began to lose their central role in community life. Festivals that had coordinated agricultural activities for centuries were replaced by Hebrew religious observances that followed entirely different calendars. But perhaps most threatening of all was the Hebrew insistence on exclusive worship. Other conquering peoples had typically been content to add their gods to existing pantheons, creating syncretic religious systems that preserved local traditions while acknowledging new divine authorities. The Hebrews demanded something unprecedented: complete abandonment of all other religious loyalties. This wasn't just religious intolerance, it was cultural revolution. Everything that had made Canaanite civilization function was being declared not just wrong but evil. The sacred groves where communities had gathered for festivals became abominations. The high places where families had brought offerings for generations became sites of corruption. The fertility rituals that had been central to agricultural life became acts of spiritual adultery. By 1000 before Christ, as the Hebrew kingdoms of Israel and Judah consolidated their power under King David, the conflict had evolved from military conquest to cultural transformation. Yet Baal was far from defeated. Entrenched in the great Phoenician cities of the coast, spreading through international trade networks, and deeply embedded in the agricultural practices of rural communities, the storm god adapted and persevered. The stage was now set for conflicts that would make the initial Hebrew conquest seem like a minor skirmish. For in the royal palaces of Israel and Judah, a new generation was rising, Hebrew kings and queens who had grown up surrounded by international influence, who understood the political advantages of religious tolerance, and who were about to discover that compromise with Baal was far more dangerous than outright war had ever been. The transformation began innocuously enough in 874 before Christ, when King Ahab of Israel married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Tyre. What appeared to be a brilliant diplomatic marriage, securing trade relationships with the most powerful Phoenician city-state, would trigger the most dramatic religious confrontation in ancient history. Jezebel arrived in Samaria not merely as a foreign queen, but as a devoted priestess of Baal Melkart, determined to restore her god's rightful dominion over what she saw as a wayward province. Archaeological excavations at Tel Jezreel have revealed the stunning scope of Jezebel's religious revolution. Massive construction projects expanded the royal complex to accommodate Phoenician-style temples, complete with bronze altars designed for the elaborate sacrifice rituals that had been banned for generations. Ivory plaques discovered in the ruins, depicting scenes of Baal's triumph over his enemies, suggest that the queen wasn't just practicing her ancestral faith privately, she was actively promoting it as state religion. But Jezebel's challenge went far deeper than temple construction. She understood something that previous opponents of Hebrew monotheism had missed, that Yahweh worship had succeeded not through superior theology, but through demonstrated effectiveness. If Baal was to reclaim his dominion, he needed to prove his power in terms that the Hebrew people would understand. The opportunity came during the third year of severe drought that had devastated the northern kingdom. By 860 before Christ, the land was dying. Streams that had flowed for centuries ran dry, crops withered in fields that hadn't seen rain in seasons, and livestock perished in unprecedented numbers. From Jezebel's perspective, the message was clear. Yahweh had failed his people, and only Baal's intervention could restore life to the land. Enter Elijah, a prophet from the wilderness regions of Gilead, whose very appearance seemed to embody the austere demands of Hebrew monotheism. Unlike the elaborate priesthoods of Baal worship, with their ornate robes and ceremonial regalia, Elijah wore simple garments of haircloth and leather. Yet his message carried authority that shook the foundations of royal power. The drought was not evidence of Yahweh's weakness, but of his judgment against Israel's compromise with false gods. The confrontation that followed would become the most famous religious contest in ancient literature, but archaeological evidence suggests the reality was even more dramatic than biblical accounts convey. Mount Carmel, the site chosen for the showdown, was sacred to both traditions. Hebrews revered it as part of the Promised Land, while Canaanites had worshipped Baal there for over a millennium. Excavations have revealed extensive ritual installations dating to this period, including massive stone altars and channels designed to drain sacrificial blood. The contest itself was designed as the ultimate test of divine power. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, 2 sets of prayers, but only the God who could send fire from heaven would prove his reality. What made this confrontation so revolutionary was its public nature. Unlike theological debates among priestly scholars, this was a demonstration that hundreds of witnesses could observe and verify. The 450 prophets of Baal who gathered that day represented more than religious opposition. They embodied centuries of accumulated wisdom about divine manipulation. These weren't primitive shamans but highly educated specialists who understood meteorology, psychology, and the subtle arts of mass persuasion. Their rituals, documented in detail in Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra, involve precise choreography, specific invocations, and theatrical elements designed to create powerful psychological effects. 4 hours, they performed the ancient dance of storm calling, cutting themselves until blood flowed freely while chanting the names of Baal in rhythms that echoed across the mountainside. They built their fire high, arranged their sacrifice according to traditions that had never failed their ancestors, and called upon a God whose reality had been confirmed by 1,000 years of answered prayers. Yet the silence from heaven was deafening. No lightning split the sky, no flame descended to consume the offering, no voice of thunder acknowledged their devotion. For the first time in recorded history, Baal's priests faced complete, public failure in the presence of hundreds of witnesses. When Elijah stepped forward to rebuild Yahweh's altar, every detail of his preparation seemed calculated to highlight the contrast. Where the Baal priests had relied on elaborate rituals and theatrical display, Elijah used simple stones and basic construction. Where they had called upon cosmic forces through complex invocations, he offered a brief, direct prayer that any child could understand. But then came the elements that transformed the contest from religious theater to undeniable demonstration. Elijah ordered water, precious, scarce water in the midst of devastating drought, to be poured over his sacrifice not once, but 3 times, until it filled the trenches around the altar. This wasn't just confidence in divine power. It was a gesture so wasteful, so seemingly foolish, that it could only be justified by absolute certainty of supernatural intervention. The fire that fell from heaven wasn't merely impressive. According to witnesses, it consumed not only the sacrifice and the wood, but the stones of the altar itself and even the water in the trenches. This wasn't natural combustion that could be explained by hidden preparations or favorable conditions. This was a display of power that left no room for alternative explanations. The immediate aftermath revealed the true stakes of the confrontation. The 450 prophets of Baal, whose expertise and authority had been utterly discredited, were executed at the Kishon River. This wasn't religious persecution but the logical consequence of their failure. Prophets who could not deliver on their promises of divine intervention had no legitimate claim to authority or respect. But the most dramatic vindication came with the return of rain. After 3.5 years of drought, clouds gathered over Mount Carmel and released torrents that ended the crisis exactly as Elijah had predicted. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was proof that Yahweh, not Baal, controlled the weather patterns that determined life and death in the ancient world. Jezebel's response to these events revealed the deeper significance of what had occurred. Rather than accepting defeat gracefully, she declared war on Elijah personally, understanding that his victory represented more than religious triumph. It was the death knell of an entire worldview that had shaped civilization for millennia. Yet the contest on Mount Carmel was only the beginning of Baal's decline, not its end. The storm god's worship continued in modified forms throughout the region, adapting to new circumstances and finding refuge in communities that valued religious tradition over demonstrated power. In the great cities of Phoenicia, where international trade required religious flexibility, Baal merged with other deities and continued to attract devotion from merchants and sailors. The ultimate irony emerged centuries later, when the very kingdoms that had witnessed Yahweh's triumph over Baal fell to conquest by Assyrian and Babylonian empires. During the exile periods, many Hebrews found themselves questioning whether their exclusive devotion to Yahweh had been worth the cost. Surrounded by thriving pagan societies, some began to wonder if their ancestors had been too hasty in abandoning gods who might have offered protection. But by then, the transformation was irreversible. The Hebrew experience had introduced a new conception of divinity that would eventually reshape not only Judaism, but Christianity and Islam as well. The idea that there could be only one true God, that this God demanded exclusive loyalty, and that divine power should be demonstrated through historical events rather than natural cycles, became the foundation of monotheistic religion. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate the scope of this transformation. Across the ancient Near East, sites that once featured elaborate Baal temples show evidence of abandonment or conversion to other uses during the first millennium before Christ. The storm god who had once commanded the devotion of entire civilizations gradually faded into mythology, remembered more in scholarly texts than in living worship. Yet the legacy of the Baal conflict extends far beyond ancient religious history. The fundamental questions raised on Mount Carmel, about the nature of divine power, the relationship between religion and politics, and the cost of exclusive religious commitment, continue to shape human civilization. The storm god's defeat marked not just the triumph of Hebrew monotheism, but the beginning of theological controversies that would echo through every subsequent religious movement. And thus, the most feared god of antiquity was conquered not by superior military force or more sophisticated philosophy, but by a simple challenge: prove your reality through demonstrable power. When Baal failed that test before hundreds of witnesses, he began his long journey from divine terror to historical curiosity, leaving behind only ruins and artifacts to testify to powers once thought eternal. As we stand today among the excavated ruins of ancient Canaanite temples, surrounded by the broken altars and weathered stone pillars that once trembled under the weight of Baal's terrible presence, we witness something profound about the nature of human belief and the power of demonstrated truth. The storm god who commanded the devotion of entire civilizations for over 2 millennia ultimately fell not to military conquest, but to a single moment of public accountability that changed the course of human religious thought forever. The archaeological evidence tells a story that extends far beyond ancient religious conflict. In museums across the world, bronze figurines of Baal stand silent in display cases, their lightning bolts frozen in metal, their once terrifying presence reduced to historical artifacts. Yet these remnants speak to something deeper than the rise and fall of a particular deity. They reveal humanity's eternal struggle to find meaning in forces beyond our control. Baal's reign over the ancient world was built on fundamental human needs that remain unchanged today. The farmer's anxiety about weather patterns, the merchant's dependence on favorable conditions, The ruler's need for divine legitimacy. These concerns didn't disappear when the storm god fell silent on Mount Carmel. Instead, they were transformed by a new understanding of how divine power operates in human history. The contest between Baal and Yahweh established principles that would reshape not only Judaism, but eventually Christianity and Islam as well. The demand for exclusive devotion, the expectation of moral transformation rather than mere ritual observance, and the insistence that divine power should be demonstrated through historical events rather than natural cycles became the foundation stones of monotheistic religion. Perhaps most significantly, the fall of Baal marked the end of humanity's acceptance of unexplained suffering as divine caprice. Where Baal's worshippers had accepted drought, famine, and disaster as expressions of cosmic struggle between competing gods, Hebrew monotheism introduced the revolutionary concept that divine justice should be comprehensible and consistent with moral principles. This transformation reverberates through every aspect of modern civilization. Our legal systems, built on concepts of universal justice rather than arbitrary divine will. Our scientific methods, assuming that natural phenomena follow consistent laws rather than the whims of competing deities. Our democratic ideals, refusing to accept political authority based solely on claims of divine appointment. All of these developments trace their intellectual heritage back to that moment on Mount Carmel when humanity demanded the divine power justify itself through demonstration rather than tradition. Yet Baal's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the seductive power of religious compromise. The Hebrew kingdoms that witnessed Yahweh's triumph over the storm god still struggled for centuries with the temptation to hedge their bets, to maintain backup relationships with other deities just in case exclusive monotheism proved inadequate. The human tendency to seek security through multiple spiritual allegiances remains as powerful today as it was in ancient Samaria. The ruins of Baal's temples, scattered across the landscapes of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, remind us that no religious or political system, however entrenched, however ancient, however seemingly permanent, is immune to challenge by demonstrable truth. The storm god who controlled the fate of nations for 2,000 years fell to a simple test. Prove your power when it matters most. In our own age, when competing ideologies claim absolute authority and demand unquestioning loyalty, Baal's defeat offers both warning and hope. Warning that systems built on fear rather than demonstrated truth will ultimately face their own Mount Carmel moments. Hope that human beings retain the capacity to recognize authentic power when confronted with undeniable evidence. The bronze lightning bolts in Baal's silent hands no longer terrify museum visitors, but they should inspire us to ask the same questions that Elijah posed on that ancient mountaintop. Which powers in our world are real, which are mere projection of human anxiety, and how can we tell the difference when everything we value hangs in the balance? If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share in the comments what surprised you most about Baal's incredible journey.